Hey Firsties! So we are going to read another book this week, and this book is all about Hanukkah. So I'm sure a lot of you all, most of you all know about Christmas, and maybe you even celebrate Christmas, but there are a lot of people in our country and all over the world that celebrate Hanukkah. And Hanukkah starts on December 11th, so that's a Friday. And we're going to read a little story about a little girl named Rachel, and there's a lot of things that happen in the story, but there are a lot of things in our story that you'll notice that have a lot to do with Hanukkah, because she celebrates Hanukkah with her family. And her next door neighbor also celebrates Hanukkah. So we're going to read this book and see what happens. And when we get finished, you're going to go back to Seesaw and you're going to tell me what happened in the story. So you're going to retell the story. So tell the story again. So kind of be thinking about what happens in the beginning of the story, in the middle part of the story, and then at the end of the story, okay? So let's read our book about Hanukkah. So this is called Mrs. Greenburg's Messy Hanukkah, and it's written by Linda Glasser and illustrated by Nancy Cote. And you can already see, this is called a menorah, and the menorah has candles on it, and every night of Hanukkah, the people who celebrate Hanukkah, the families, will light a candle for each night. So that's a big part of Hanukkah and what people do to celebrate Hanukkah. So Mrs. Greenburg's Messy Hanukkah. And this is a recipe for some potato latkes. And latkes are kind of like a crispy potato pancake. I know that sounds kind of odd, but it's not really sweet like a pancake, but they kind of look like pancakes. But they're salty, kind of like potatoes would be. Almost like French fries would taste, I think. I think that's the way that they taste, but that's a big part, a big food that they fix for Hanukkah too. So let's see what happens. Remember, you're thinking what happens in the beginning, the middle, and the end of the story. Please, can we make potato latkes today? Rachel sat at the kitchen table swinging her legs. And let's invite Mrs. Greenburg for dinner. Enough with the latkes. Mama threw her hands in the air. I told you already, we'll make them next week when the relatives come. That's when we'll invite Mrs. Greenburg. But tonight won't even feel like the first night of Hanukkah. Rachel took the menorah from the cupboard and pushed the first 2 candles in. No latkes, no company. We'll still light the candles. Mama kissed her on the nose. It'll be Hanukkah, don't worry. But right now, Papa and I have lots of errands, so please get your coat on. Rachel set the menorah on the windowsill. It was such a cold, gray day out there, just the kind that begged you to make the house all warm and good smelling. That gave her an idea. Can I stay next door with Mrs. Greenburg? All afternoon, Mama shook her head. Please, asked Rachel. Well, she's not so used to little monkeys. Papa gave Rachel a playful poke. But it's almost Hanukkah, and she's all alone, Rachel pointed out. She could use a little company. I didn't think of that. Well, I suppose, Mama looked at Papa, if you won't be any trouble. I'm never any trouble. Rachel pulled on her coat and raced out the door, braids flying. Wait, Mama called after her. I'll telephone just to make sure. But Rachel was already skipping down the path. So what has happened so far at the beginning of the story? Rachel is going over to Mrs. Greenburg's house. Mrs. Greenburg's house was all clean and sparkly, like it was just waiting for company, while Rachel's house always looked like it was still in bed with its hair sticking up. And Mrs. Greenburg was always glad to see her. Come in, don't be a stranger, said Mrs. Greenburg. I told your dear Mama, of course you can stay. It's much too empty around here, especially for Hanukkah. Rachel stepped inside. That's just what I told her. She peeled off her coat. Can we make latkes? Oh my, said Mrs. Greenburg. I haven't made latkes in years. But latkes make it feel like Hanukkah, Rachel explained. It's some messy job, said Mrs. Greenburg. All that grating and frying. But Mama and Papa would be so surprised. Rachel jumped in the air. I didn't think of that. I do have plenty of potatoes. Wonderful, Rachel exclaimed. She skipped into the kitchen where everything had its very own place, and it all sparkled, even the floor. Mrs. Greenburg handed her an apron, and they both got right to work grating potatoes. Rachel tried to keep her gratings in a nice little hill like Mrs. Greenburg's, but somehow her little hill slid right off the table. Oops, said Rachel. Oi, said Mrs. Greenburg. What a mushy mess. Rachel grabbed the mop, but the more she mopped, the worse it got. That's okay, Mrs. Greenburg took the mop. I'll finish later. Don't you worry. After all, what's a little grated potato between friends? So is Rachel starting to make a mess when they're making the latkes? No. Next, it was time for the egg. Rachel tried to crack it into the bowl just like Mama always did, but somehow it popped right out of her hands. Oops, said Rachel. Oi, said Mrs. Greenburg. What a slippery mess. Rachel grabbed the mop, but the more she mopped, the worse it got. That's fine, I'll finish it later. Mrs. Greenburg stepped over the shiny yellow streaks. Don't you worry. After all, what's a little egg between friends? She gave a sigh. Soon we'll have Hanukkah latkes, Rachel reminded her. Mrs. Greenburg stirred everything in a big bowl. Rachel lugged over a bag of flour. Don't we need this? But somehow the bag ripped. Oops, said Rachel. Hoy, said Mrs. Greenburg. What a powdery mess. Rachel grabbed the mop, but the more she mopped, the worse it got. Never mind. I'll get it later, said Mrs. Greenburg. Don't you worry. After all, what's a little flour between friends? But she looked awfully tired. Soon it'll feel like Hanukkah, Rachel reminded her, and she sure hoped it would. At last, it was time to fry the latkes. Mrs. Greenburg checked the clock. Your Mama and Papa will be here any minute. Quick, Rachel, drizzle a little oil into the pan. Mama uses lots of oil, said Rachel, for the miracle of when the oil lasted 8 days. But somehow the oil came spurting out faster than Rachel had expected. Much faster. Oops. What a soppy mess. Rachel reached for the mop. Don't even bother. Mrs. Greenburg sank into a chair in the living room. Just let me rest a few minutes. Anyway, what's a little oil after all of this? She flung her arm at the kitchen. Rachel waited for the part about friends, but not a word, and nothing about don't you worry either. Uh-oh, the kitchen was a mess, like it might faint if it looked at itself in the mirror. What would Mama and Papa say? Just then, the back door opened. Anybody home? Called Papa. Mama stepped into the kitchen. Oh no. Surprise? Squeaked Rachel, trying to smile. We're making latkes. Mama and Papa did look surprised, but not the way Rachel had hoped. Not at all. Papa pointed at the floor. What's all of this? Mama frowned. Rachel, look what you've done. Rachel's chin trembled. I wanted to make it feel like Hanukkah, but I made a terrible mess. A tear slid down her nose. I'm sorry. Mrs. Greenburg hurried over. Oh, Katchkula, you dear little duck. She rubbed the tear away with her thumb. Actually, it's not a terrible mess. It's a wonderful mess. My house hasn't felt this lived in years. Really? Rachel brightened up. Well, I can make it lived in anytime you want. Mrs. Greenburg laughed out loud. Oh, darling, I'm sure you can. Rachel grabbed the mop. Now let's really clean up. Don't be silly. I'll do it later, said Mrs. Greenburg. Do me a favor, said Papa. Sit down and relax. That's right, said Rachel. We want to do it. Mama tied on an apron and fried up the latkes crispy and hot while Rachel and Papa cleaned up. Now the house was all sparkly, warm, and good smelling. Mrs. Greenburg lit the candles and said the blessings. Finally, everything was just how Rachel had imagined. Thank you, Mrs. Greenburg. Well, don't thank me. Thank you. Mrs. Greenburg grandly set the latkes on the table. I've got latkes and company. You sure do. Rachel hugged Mrs. Greenburg around her nice soft middle and gave a happy sigh. Now this feels like Hanukkah. The end. So the potato latkes that they were trying to make is a really popular food that people eat at Hanukkah time, and people that celebrate Hanukkah make that at Hanukkah time a lot of times. So what you're going to do is you're going to go back to Seesaw and you're going to retell the story to me. So I want you to tell me what happened in the beginning of our story, what happened in the middle, and what happened at the end. And don't forget to try to use those transition words that we've talked about too. So like you could say in the beginning, you could say then or next, or even like finally or last. So don't forget to use those when you retell our story, okay? I hope you enjoyed our Hanukkah story, and happy Hanukkah. I can't wait to see what you guys do on Seesaw.